George, if it's you, do let me know that you found me, and we're gonna continue. Excellent. So let's continue. Sorry, YouTube crashed, interrupted the live stream, and then let me start it all over again. So we're gonna continue from here. So the body, the quartered body of Saint Emmeram, was brought to Regensburg and was buried in one of those old Roman churches. And he was made the first martyr. And we are talking about this period of early Christianity when those martyrs were getting to become very important. And that's why a lot of pilgrims started traveling to Regensburg. In the 800s, that old church was expanded. The monks of the Saint Benedict order were invited to establish the monastery by the last dukes of Bavaria. The Saint Emmeram Church became part of the abbey, and the Saint Emmeram Abbey, which was founded by those Saint Benedict order monks here in the southeastern part of the city, became a very important religious entity, a very important abbey in this part of Europe in the early Middle Ages. And for centuries, it remained being very powerful, both in terms of religion and in terms of politics, and a very wealthy landlord, one of the biggest landlords in Central Europe in the Middle Ages, because all those rulers would present that abbey with a lot of lands. So the existence of that abbey turned Regensburg into one of the major centers of Christianity. During the last Bavarian dukes, Regensburg became the seat, the center of the diocese that happened in the middle of the 700s. And all that made Regensburg important for Karl the Great. And Arnulf, who was the last direct descendant of Karl the Great, became a big fan of the city because he was a big fan of the Saint Emmeram Abbey, and he was a very pious man. And he built his castle right next to the Saint Emmeram Abbey in this part of the city. Unfortunately, nothing has left from this castle. There's just a place of burial of Arnulf in the Saint Emmeram Abbey, which we're going to see during the second part of this tour, Regensburg through art. Now let's continue our walk. In the early Middle Ages, Regensburg became one of the major centers of Christianity, with the Saint Emmeram Abbey, with being the center of the diocese and the seat of the bishop. And from here, Christianity spread to many parts of Central and Eastern Europe. 12 princes from Prague, from the Bohemian Kingdom, got Christianed here in Regensburg. Having returned to the Bohemian Kingdom, which is today known as Czechia, they started baptizing the local elite, and they also baptized the Polish elite and the Polish rulers. But it all started here in Regensburg. So we are now in the southeastern part of the old town. We haven't been here much. And here you can see a mix of architecture, some modern buildings, like this one, it's a commercial building. Just a few old ones. Here's an example. And a lot of apartment blocks with some stores on the ground floor, which were actually built in the post-war period, because this part of the city was damaged in the World War II air raids. The Allies carried out several air raids to destroy the local Messerschmitt factory and the oil refinery. And during one of them, this part of the old town was seriously damaged. And that's the only part of the old town which was damaged in the air raids of the Second World War. So now back to history. So in the early Middle Ages, Regensburg became the center of one of the major centers of Christianity in this part of the world, which attracted to this place Karl the Great, who lived here for about 2 years. Upon becoming that Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800, he decided to have his first imperial parliament session here in Regensburg, making it one of the major political centers of his Holy Roman Empire. And starting from that time, Regensburg continued being one of the major religious and political centers of the Holy Roman Empire. More monasteries, more abbeys were founded here, including this one, which is known as the Obermünster Abbey, and it was the abbey for the nuns, for the women from the noble local families. And that's what's left of this Obermünster monastery. This round tower, which belongs to the period of 10 to 1100s, so that's Romanesque architecture. Look at those Romanesque windows. They also belong to the 10 and 1100s. The entrance portal. And over there in the backdrop are the remains of the abbey. The abbey was destroyed in that wartime air raid. So the abbey was established in the 800s as the place for the women who wanted to dedicate their lives to God, and that was quite trendy at the time in the early Middle Ages, when people were getting to be very devout. At least one child in the family, be it a boy or a girl, had to be dedicated to God, had to dedicate his life to God. So for girls, women from the noble families, the original monastery didn't last till our days. It was damaged with the fire. And in the late 900s, the new one was built here, following the orders of another Holy Roman Emperor. And these are the remains of the abbey, which was built in the 9 and 1000s. It became the place of burial for centuries of the representatives of the local elite. And here, stuck onto the wall, you can see the remains of the tombstones, which belong to the Middle Ages. So the person who ordered to build here the second version of the abbey's building was another Holy Roman Emperor who was a very pious man known by the name Henry II. Let me show you his image. And we talked about this emperor a lot during our visit to Bamberg. So he's the one, he's standing here in the center. Quite a pious image because he was known for being a very religious man. Together with his wife, they started building that famous cathedral in Bamberg. So he was the one who made Bamberg another center of his empire, so the major center of his Holy Roman Empire. But before the Bamberg Cathedral was built, in the first decades of the 11th century, he would spend a lot of time here in Regensburg. He endorsed construction of the second building of this abbey and was regarded for a long time as a major benefactor of this abbey. And this was an active abbey up until the first decade of the 1800s. Then during the Napoleonic War, the rulers of Bavaria, the kings of Bavaria, started the so-called secularization reform. Most of the monasteries and abbeys got closed. The land was confiscated by the king of Bavaria. They lost all of their privileges. Later, some of them were reopened, but they had to pay to the king in order to get some of their lands back. Some were never reopened, and the land was distributed, was sold to those people who had the money. So it was done by the king of Bavaria, basically to get rid of those large entities with a lot of power and wealth, which had been established during the Middle Ages, to get more power and to get more profits from that. And that's when the St. Amram and the Obermünster Abbey got closed. And that's a great example of the medieval tower built in the Romanesque style in the 10 and 1100s in the square shape. Let's continue. And we are walking around the old town, which became part of UNESCO World Heritage in 2006. It's known for being the largest medieval old town north of the Alps, which means outside Italy. These days, it's the center, that yellow building, is the headquarters of the Obermünster Abbey. And they even have a small museum there. So in some way, the abbey was re-established, but it's of course not back to its glory days, the way it was in the Middle Ages. So between 7 and 900s, Regensburg was really favored by those early Holy Roman emperors. It was getting to become a major center of Christianity in Central Europe, but it also started gradually growing as a major place of trade located on the Danube River. You won't see here in the old town those half-timber, very German old houses. Because most of the buildings in the old town were built of stone, and most of them, George, are original. And we're now walking away, further away from the southeastern border of the city. And the southeastern part of the city was damaged in the war. We are walking more towards the heart of the old city. And here you can see all of the original buildings. And oftentimes, looking at the facades, which have been remodeled many times through the course of history, you can see the traces of the old windows. Here's a great example, which belong to the Middle Ages. This is the Romanesque architecture that's 1200s. And most of the old stone houses here were built in the period between 12 and 1400s, and they were the houses of the wealthy merchants of Regensburg who had enough money to build their city mansions, the dwellings from the locally mined stone. And even those houses which were remodeled, elevated, were made bigger in the 17 and 1800s, they stand on the basements and the ground floors of those ones which had been built between 12 and 1400s. And oftentimes you can see the original stone, which was left uncovered, unplastered on purpose. I don't know whether it's visible during the live stream, but the walls of quite a lot of buildings are not that straight because, well, you're looking at the house which is about 1,000 years old. A lot of those old buildings preserve the original entrance portals. And look at this building, it's part of the city's heritage. And totally, Regensburg's old town has about 800 listed buildings. And look at this entrance portal. It was designed in the Romanesque style. The portal belongs to the 1100s, and historians say that it was modeled on the portal of the famous Scottish church. And we're gonna see it during the art part of the tour. We have seen it before, that Scottish church with an amazing Romanesque portal which tells some religious stories. And a feature of the Romanesque architecture was to incorporate the animal and the flower patterns. And you can clearly see it here. And a lot of buildings even preserved the old family emblems of their past owners, which take us back to the Middle Ages. George, the first migration of the Scottish monks happened as early as the 8th century. They were encouraged by the Pope to arrive in Central Europe to start spreading the word of God. And they were known for being very hardworking and very, very pious. So at first, for the first time, they came into Central Europe and established their presence, their small churches and monasteries in the 8th century. And then the second wave of migration was in the 1000s. And in the 1000s, they were already supported both by the Pope, by the Church, and by the wealthy merchants from Western Europe, who had to travel on business to Central and Eastern Europe, and they established their presence as far east as Kievan Rus. According to the records, they had the monastery and church even in Kiev, built in the 11th century. And although they were called the Scottish monks, back then in the Middle Ages, they actually were from Ireland. But people in Central Europe didn't know the difference between the Scottish, basically, and the Irish. And they called them here the Scottish monks, the Scotti, although they were from Ireland. But they were very important in Christianizing Central Europe and establishing the monasteries and churches here. And one of the most magnificent local churches was built by the Scottish monks, and it's still known as the Scottish Church, in the 11th century. And we're going to see it during the art part of the tour. These are not murals. These are drawn on paper, and they are dedicated to the history of Regensburg. Saint Emmeram, Regen, the name of the river, the stone bridge, the Danube, and here you can see the Danube, that famous salt storage house. Local houses, and that man on the top, and we're going to talk about him in a few minutes. And we're now in the heart of the old town. In the old days, this area was actually the Jewish quarter of Regensburg. George, if you have time, I know we have a quite busy program here, but not as busy as always. If you have time, I highly recommend you watch the recording of the Hansa League Museum, because I think you missed that tour on Zoom, but I sent you the link. I sent you the links to the recordings on Monday. And when in the Hansa League Museum in Lübeck, we discussed how those Lübeck merchants crossed the Baltic Sea west-east and sailed all the way down to Novgorod, which was in northern Kievan Rus, in northern Rus, to trade with Novgorod merchants as early as in 1100s. And they didn't have the maps. They had to navigate those northern seas, sailing towards the northern star and looking at the landscape, which had been documented by them, and basically reading those written descriptions of the landscape. It's amazing. So anyhow, we are on one of the squares of the old town. And at least from the 1000s and up until 1519, here was the Jewish quarter. Then in 1519, the Jews were expelled from Regensburg, although it happened much later than in other places. The Regensburg Jewish community, and we're going to talk about that in detail later today, became known for actually being able to live in one place, in one area in Regensburg for 600 consecutive years, which was amazing. They were not expelled from here during the Black Death. They were protected by the residents of Regensburg. But finally, in 1519, they had to leave. The Jewish quarter was erased, and in the second half of the 1500s, they built here the church, which became the first Protestant newly built church in the city. During the Reformation period, Regensburg embraced Reformation. All of the townspeople, city hall people, became Protestant. The majority of the population became Protestant, with around 25% of the locals remaining Catholic. But interestingly enough, although officially the city became Protestant or Lutheran, it continued being the center of the diocese, and the Regensburg Cathedral remained Catholic. It didn't close its main abbeys, including the St. Amaram Abbey, the Obermünster Abbey, and the Niedermünster Abbey, which remained being Catholic. So it ended up being a mix. The city with a very strong Catholic presence. And quite a lot of action here in the morning with all of those refuse trucks and delivery. And recycling. So the Regensburg Cathedral, which we're going to explore in detail because there's quite a lot of interesting art there during the second part of the tour, Regensburg through personalities. That's what we're doing today, Regensburg through art. This episode is coming up next. And George, if you have a chance, do join this tour, Regensburg through art, during the afternoon time, my time. I think I've scheduled it for 5 because I'm not sure that they will let me walk around the cathedral during the morning tour. In the afternoon, yes, for sure, but I'm not sure about the morning time. And that's when we will go in and talk about the art which is there. So just one major comment about the Regensburg Cathedral, also known as the Regensburg Dome. It's regarded being the masterpiece, the most important, the most imposing Gothic religious building in all of Bavaria. Its height is about 330 feet, together with the spires. And it took 400 years to build the main building without the spires. The spires were added in the late 1800s. The main building was built between late 12th and early 1600s. Right, George, and I think it's Regensburg through art, and that's when we go. That's when we will go inside the cathedral. Yes, it's later today. Thank you. And we continue our walk around the old town. So, because Regensburg was that mix in terms of religion, and rather tolerant to Catholics, unlike a lot of other cities in Bavaria, it was a preferred seat of all those political gatherings and imperial parliament sessions held by the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire who came from the Habsburg dynasty. So starting from the late 1400s, Habsburgs, the representatives of both the Austrian and the Spanish dynasties, would become next Holy Roman Emperors. One of them actually built Augsburg, where we were earlier, where we were last year. All that beautiful Renaissance architecture in Augsburg. So that was started by the Habsburgs. Starting from the late 1400s, Habsburgs, who were very Catholic, particularly the Spanish branch, would become Holy Roman Emperors. And they had to have those imperial parliament sessions. And they preferred to have them in Regensburg, which was open and tolerant of Catholics. So here's the image of, where is he? Karl V with a local woman. So Karl V was a representative of the Habsburg dynasty, a quite prominent Holy Roman Emperor living in the 1500s. He held most of his imperial parliament sessions here in Regensburg. He was a very devout Catholic. And during one of those imperial parliament sessions, he met a local woman. And that's a visualization of the affair which they had here in Regensburg. And a child was born, and later the child, the son, would become a very important military dignitary in Europe. So that's Charles V and Barbara Blomberg. And still today, Regensburg has this building, which is called as the Blomberg House, because the Blomberg family, including their daughter, Barbara Blomberg, lived here. And that's Barbara Blomberg. So although illegitimate, the son was acknowledged by his father, Karl V, was sent from Regensburg to his royal court in Spain, spent a lot of time in Holland, in the Netherlands, and later in his life became a very important military dignitary. And we're going to talk about him, continue our story about him in a few minutes. Meanwhile, we are looking towards the building, which is at the front. The facade is decorated with the busts of its former owners, a wealthy merchant family of Regensburg. And those wealthy merchant families would call themselves the patricians, and that's a patrician castle, which for the first time was built in the second half of the 1200s. Over time, it was remodeled. The windows changed its shape, but these are some of the original Romanesque windows. In late 1945, first half of 1946, this building became the last address in Germany for Oskar and Emilia Schindler, who fled to Regensburg at the end of the Second World War from Czechia, who stayed here until September 1946, and then from here they immigrated to Argentina. So we are at the town hall square, looking at the complex of the town hall buildings. The complex was built. But you heard the story of Barbara Blomberg, right? Charles V and their son, who was conceived here and later in history and in his life became a quite important military dignitary. So next to this complex are the town hall buildings, and we're gonna talk about this complex in a few minutes. There is his statue, the statue to Don Juan. That's how he became known in history. An illegitimate son of Barbara Blomberg and Charles V, who was conceived here, but that's his only connection with Regensburg. He actually didn't spend much time here as a child. He was sent to the court of his father where he grew up, and he spent most of his life living between Spain and on the territories which belonged to the Spanish Habsburgs. He became a military person, a commander, and was appointed in charge of the Christian navy during a very important battle between the Christians and the Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, which was held on the Mediterranean Sea. It became known as the Battle of Lepanto, and it was one of the first major battles between the Christians and the Muslims. According to the stories which were written by the historians about that battle in the 1500s, the flags with the holy images were flying over the Christian fleet. And of course, they helped the Christians won in that battle. The Christian fleet was commanded by Don Juan. So he won in that battle, which made him a prominent military dignitary of the 1500s. This monument was created to him being that important person who defeated the Turkish navy, and Christianity was saved. Now, not any longer, but a few years ago, it was a quite contradictory monument in Regensburg because he is standing with his foot over the head of a Muslim Turk. Of course, the monument was created in the 1800s, and at that time, it symbolized a pure fact that the Muslims were defeated. But now it's a little bit controversial. But the monument is here, and there are no intentions to move it away. So the complex of the town hall buildings was built between 12 and 1600s. In the Middle Ages, Regensburg continued its growth. At first, it was an important center of religious and political power in the early Middle Ages, right? And then starting from the 1000s, it was getting to become a very important merchant city located on that important trading route which crossed Europe west-east. In 1240s, Regensburg received the status of a free imperial city, and that's when the first town hall building was built. And a free imperial city meant that it was basically run by the chosen, the elected by the residents, town hall people. The town hall building was built, this first building, that's the oldest one, with a tower in 1240s, and that's one of the many towers of Regensburg. Some 100 years later, in the first decades of the 1300s, they added the second building with one main room inside, and this one was for the imperial parliament sessions. All of the imperial parliament sessions ever held in Regensburg were held here. And when it was not used by the imperial parliament sessions, it was used by the local town hall people for their gatherings and for the meetings of the legal court. And the verdicts were announced from the open window up there, and in the ground floor, there are rooms for torturers and executioners. The sound of the bell marked a 1/4 and the sound has come from the top of this tower, from the clock there. And then in the 1600s, they added the second building, a more modern one, designed in Baroque style, as the new extension of the town hall. And these days, it has offices of the 3 mayors of Regensburg. Regensburg has 3 mayors. And this town hall, and basically the trade in the old days, we've talked a lot about that during our trips around Germany, so that all these squares in the old days were places of trade, including this one right in front of the town hall. The trade started here and went all the way to the main square of the cathedral and behind the cathedral. And usually in the old days, the measurement tools were provided by the town hall people. The town hall people were responsible for supervising that the goods were of proper quality, that the trade was conducted following the rules, and all of the measurements were correct. And you are looking at the old measurement tools. And the large city scale were all city scales were also here. At some point, they were kept in the space behind this portal. Not any longer, but in the old days, for some time they were kept there. And we are heading into another square, which is the final point of our today's tour. And located on the square, which actually preserved its original shape, and according to the historians, it got this layout during the time of the Romans, and the urban city was here. We are now outside the fort of the legionaries, but inside the Roman urban settlement. So the square got its triangle shape during the time of the Romans. And that shape gave the square its name. And all the buildings which you see here belong to that period between 12 and 1400s. They were the houses of the wealthy patricians. This one was repurposed into the house where they kept more city scale, and then later it became the men's club. That's where the local merchant elite discussed trade and business. The only building here in the neoclassical style is this mansion, which was actually remodeled in the 1800s. Originally, here were 3 old Gothic houses which were purchased by one wealthy family, Dittmar, and that wealthy family, who were the industrialists and belonged to the local nobility, turned those 3 Gothic mansions into one neoclassical palace. And still today, the building is called the Thon Dittmar, after the family palace, which is a municipal building, a big cultural hub. We're going to talk about that during the next episode. Today, let's focus on this castle with a tower. Built in the 1200s, it was a castle of a wealthy local family, which was repurposed in the later Middle Ages into a hotel. And the German kings, dukes, and those Holy Roman emperors would stay there during the time in Regensburg when they attended those imperial parliament sessions. And according to the historians, Don Juan, that illegitimate son of Karl V and Barbara Blomberg, was conceived in this hotel. So then the story faded. The story of Don Juan faded in the 1700s. Those victories over the Muslims by that time became less important, and the history was brought back only in the 1800s. Thanks to that Bavarian king who built Munich the way we know it today, who was a big fan